Great. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce today our speaker, Zac Painter. Zac is one of our CORES affiliates who's an engineering librarian at the Terman Library here at Stanford. And the libraries here have been quite instrumental in pushing forward practices around data sharing and research object sharing. And so we're very lucky today to have Zac here to talk to us about the practical side of sharing research objects. Please, Zac, take it away.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Pretty excited to give the talk today. If I can use this analogy, last week we had John, the forerunner, there, and he gave the theoretical talk on sharing research objects. And now I'm here to sort of preach the gospel of the practical side. John also made a joke when we were talking about kind of planning for this event that if you go last, it's like you're the headliners of the concert lineup. And I guess that makes me the main event. It's pretty cool. So I'm here for it, and I'm all about it. My real hope today is to show you several tools that you can use. My anticipation is that you will not use all of these tools. I don't think that everybody's going to use everything that I show off. This is more of just, here are some things that you could use or options that you do have. And it's fine. Part of the concept and the process around sharing research objects is that there's new stuff that comes out all the time, every day, so often, and just being aware of what is out there and sort of the thinking about how you might share your stuff. It was said last week, and I will say it again at least once more and probably more often, but it is a lot easier to share your research objects if you know that you're going to share research objects. And if you plan for, here's how I'm going to share these research objects, your life will be a lot better thinking about that planning and then actually doing the sharing thing. The other thing I'd like to point out here is I'm going to show off some sort of local Stanford system support stuff. So we're going to talk about some things that we either subscribe to or that we have sort of teaching and support for, and some other things. There's some free tools that we'll point out. There's some open source ones. There's some proprietary software. There's some companies that I'll point out. It's going to be a mixed bag of things, but the hope and the idea is that you're going to be able to see a variety of things in a variety of solutions. So I started speaking, to a couple of people, John and some other people work in Stanford libraries who are CORES affiliates. And one of them is my boss. And I told her I was going to go over the FAIR principles for data. And the FAIR principles are, findable, accessible, interoperable, reproducible. And I was going to walk through the talk of like going through FAIR and sharing all this stuff with everybody. And she told me I needed to reverse that because, Rafe doesn't really roll off the tongue in the same way. And it's kind of unfortunate that it doesn't. But it is worth pointing out that all the findable data in the world is useless if the data isn't usable. It's great to have access to tons of data. I've got a nice story. I worked at the EPA for a year, and my boss told me once we were going through some servers and doing some server migrations, and he said, we have this image data on here. And I said, oh, cool, what's it about? And he says, we don't have a clue. Like literally this stuff was sitting there and it was terabytes of data, and they had no idea what it was. There was no metadata. There's no way to contact anybody. The people who had run it, some of them were contractors and they had left long ago. We just didn't have any idea what this stuff was. And so we're like, oh, well, all right, cool. What are we going to do with this? And so it's great to have all the data. We had all the data in the world, but that particular data was useless, and we didn't really have a way to know what it was. And so my hope is more like, it's great to have findable stuff, but you really need to make it reusable, and you really need to make it interoperable, and think about that. Again, like, I'm not trying to downplay the findable part, because if you have wonderful data and nobody finds it, well, that's as big of a problem, right? It's the whole ecosystem of the thing, but it's a lot more worthwhile if your stuff is actually reusable and interoperable. Then, you can make it findable, and everybody in the world will be very happy, and go from there. So, next sort of tab I want to show you. When I was planning for this talk, one of the first thing I'm going to kind of show off, to reiterate John's comment earlier about, it's easier to share your research objects if you know you're going to share them ahead of time. Planning makes your life a lot easier in this case. And so actually, this was going to be the last thing that I showed in the talk, but I have promoted it to first because of John's comments. And this is DMTool. We are, Stanford is a partner with DMTool. Amy Hodge I think Amy is really the institutional admin. I think I'm listed as an organizational admin. I used to be the institutional admin where I last worked. But DMTool is a way for you to sort of plan out how you're going to script your data management plans. And, I haven't created one of these, but I'm just going to show you, hey, I'm going to create one. So, what research project are you planning? I'm just going to click this. And then, it's a test. And then let's do National Science Foundation, sure. And then you can look at, which research project are you planning? So I'm an engineering librarian. I'm going to pick engineering. But there are multiple templates that apply to this funder. And so I can click on this, and what it'll do is it'll give you some guidance to see some things that you might want to put in here, and it'll help you kind of draft that plan out. It gives you a lot of structure for creating these plans, and the guidance from at least DMTool will change pretty regularly, depending on when funders decide to update their policies. I really like this tool. It's one that I've used and collaborated with several researchers before, and data management planning is increasingly prevalent among funders, among publishers, among anybody who has any interest in the research process. And having a tool, literally DMTool, but having a tool like this to kind of help draft those plans if you're working with a new funder, or there's somebody who's new in your lab and they have some questions about, I don't know what I should put in for the storage and backup. What should I put in here? I don't know what our policies or sort of support is for that. You have ways to actually get that. And the other nice thing about DMTool is that you can request feedback from us as well. I think Amy Hodge had told me she's gotten very few requests from feedback from Stanford authors, and I guess I'm maybe running a risk of opening up a deluge of requests, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But there is a way to sort of get feedback about the plan that you've written up, what you might want to consider adding or changing. So I do want to put this out there as just, this is something that's pretty useful. I like promoting it. So you've thought about the planning, how you're going to plan out for your objects, and how your documents and your files and your research is going to be shareable. And now you need some way to actually prepare the documents themselves. And I'm going to make a couple of distinctions with some of the other things I'm going to show here. So some of those are going to be tools that you can use to sort of tidy up or clean up or change the objects themselves. And some of them are going to be the tools or platforms that you use to actually share said data. So the first one, I've not used this tool personally, but this is another one where I'm going to go back to a previous conversation that I had. So when I was at UMass and I helped people with their data management plans, I got 2 questions a lot from faculty and other researchers. And one was about, where do I place my data? What repositories do I put it in? Everybody had this question. And the other was metadata. I got so many people wondering, what can I do about metadata? I don't know what to do about the metadata. And so I'll speak a little bit to the latter in this one. I used to give a blanket recommendation to people, and I still kind of do this, that ideally you will find a metadata schema in your field if one exists in the field. And if one doesn't exist in the field, I usually recommend people to use Dublin Core at the time. That was what I would typically say, but for most people, I tried to say, of course, many of these requests I got for review were my plan and funding proposal is due 2 days from now or 12 hours from now, and I just need an answer, and it's kind of hard to dig through stuff with that immediate speed, but we tried our best. And so I would tell people, you should find or use the schema in your field, and many fields do have something that is acceptable and what you should use. But I've decided to kind of walk back the Dublin Core blanket recommendation a little bit, because one of the associations that I'm in, it's a big group of data people, and traditionally they've been very social science focused, but it's a wider group now, and they've got a lot of links to the DDI. I would say DDI initiative, but that's one of those words where the I in DDI literally means initiative. So DDI is Data Documentation Initiative. And, when I was having a conversation about planning for this speech, I got the recommendation, you should tell them about DDI. And I was like, DDI isn't that just like a social science thing? And it was like, no, it's not just a social science thing. It literally is Data Documentation Initiative. And I was like, oh, well, I actually kind of like DDI. I would recommend that to a lot of people. I really like how it works. And I think it's probably better overall than Dublin Core. Even though Dublin Core is great, I don't have that much of a problem with it. But then I got this recommendation for Collectica, and I haven't used it myself, and so I can't speak a lot to it. But what Collectica will allow you to do is kind of input DDI metadata into your research objects. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. And frankly, having a code book or a metadata scheme, or just here's my data, here's what it all means, making it so that ideally you are never contacted by somebody who wants to reuse your stuff. That's an opinion that I've heard several times, and it took me a while to understand what that meant. But I get it now. You don't want to be bombarded with all the requests for somebody who is trying to look through your work and says, I don't understand what this field means. The abbreviation is unclear, or this particular method is unclear. So I wanted to show off, a tool that you can use to help you fill out that metadata in a variety of contexts, and make some recommendations about talking about what metadata should be and how you should use it. It's pretty important to have, your documentation, your code books, your various metadata schemes, And there are some tools out there that will kind of help you do that and populate things themselves. I know that Dublin Core has, one that I used to recommend to people all the time. This is one for DDI. It's just out there for sort of notes and posterity. So moving on a little bit, I've got a command line tool. So some of you may have a file in a particular format and you need to change it to another format. And there's a couple of file conversion tools that I think that are worth mentioning here. And so one of those tools is Pandoc, and let me actually pull up my little terminal window. So Pandoc is a command line based tool. It gives you the nice little warning of this is free software. See the source, there is no warranty. And if you've used R before, you get the same warranty and it pops up and it looks very frightening the first couple times you see it. But it's great, trust me. So what Pandoc will do is if you have a document from one particular format and you need to change it to another format, Pandoc can do that for you. I really like kind of showing off Pandoc. I know that sure, Microsoft Word will allow you to export a file as a PDF. Cool. But there are times when using those software, it doesn't export to everything. You can't always make it, say, an HTML or a tech document or Markdown. It's doing those transfers is kind of hard. So that's why, I have the recommendation here for Pandoc as a way for you to, be able to transmit files from one type to another. This is kind of the files themselves. Another tool that, I've used in the past for this is Stat Transfer. And the way that Stat Transfer works, I don't have this installed on my machine, but, I can talk to you about it. The way this will work, if you're familiar with R, for example, so R has some packages like Foreign and Haven and Read XLS, which will take stuff from one of those file types and transform it into something you can use in R. And that's good for the people who use R. And I'm all on board with people using R. But if let's say you're using stuff from another platform, like, my last job, a lot of people use SPSS. That was the big thing that they used. And so let's say they get a file and it's in Stata and they need to put it in SPSS because SPSS is the program that they use. Well, Stat Transfer can help you do that. So there's several different, ways that it will convert one statistical file from one package to another. So Foreign, Haven, and those tools for R, they're great for R. And if you're an R user, that's what I'll recommend to you. But if your work doesn't involve R and you're on some other platform and you need to transfer it to something else, Stat Transfer is actually a recommendation that I'll have for you. It'll sort of, I think it's the best thing that I've seen in this world that will actually, sort of move stuff from one proprietary format to another. And I'm a really big fan of it. I don't have it installed on this particular machine, but, I haven't seen anything work better than this particular one. I've skipped around a bit, but right here on this screen, I've got OpenRefine right here. So we're going to kind of move on to sort of preparing the files themselves. So kind of how you might actually, we've talked about a little bit about transferring files from one thing to another, but also the convert files and preparing them. And OpenRefine is a tool that I've used quite a bit. I've taught a lot with, and I really like. So it runs in basically you download it and then it runs inside of a browser window. Apparently I have to update, there's a new version, which is pretty cool. But what you can do is you can import various projects. You can see up here, it will take those and import them. And what OpenRefine will do is allow you to make transformations and other changes to kind of clean this up. For those of you who work in Python or R, going back to some of those a little bit, yes, there are ways to do this in those platforms. So a lot of the tidyverse packages, for example, will do many of the things that OpenRefine will do. And honestly, they probably do them a little bit better. I'm not really gonna, I don't want to fudge that one too much. However, not everybody is comfortable with using those tools, or there's a learning curve attached to them. And there's people who, might want to use something, I don't want to say low tech, because OpenRefine really is very powerful. And I know a lot of people who really, really like it because the barrier entry is low. And so I like including OpenRefine here as a way to sort of transform a lot of data, because it'll do the job pretty well. And you'll be able to clean up and sort of wrangle messy data in a way that the barrier to doing so isn't very high. Now, I do have to put in the caution that, I've heard horror stories of people who they run their stuff through OpenRefine and they think, great, it's solved, life is good, I can move on. And that may be true and it may not be true. And I do want to at least put out the point in the plug that just because you put your stuff through a tool like OpenRefine, or even one of the many R tools that I've mentioned, just because you ran it through there doesn't mean that it's entirely good, or you should just blanket trust its recommendations. Part of the whole reusable and interoperable and accessible and all that is doing some other checks and making sure that all the stuff that you wanted to do actually happened. And just blindly trusting the machine to say that it did all the things, don't do that. Actually do some other checks. Make sure that you're not just taking the word of the computer when there may be something that you missed in the programming and whatnot. But again, I actually really like OpenRefine. I know many other people who do. It's a very accessible way to just kind of clean up computational data sets and whatnot that does not involve a really high level of technical knowledge. And for some people who don't have that, it's pretty great. I really like recommending it. The next thing I'm going to point out is Markdown. There is R Markdown. Some of you have probably heard of that. Markdown is probably one of the most basic sort of text file formats. It's a very popular choice. You could probably learn it in an hour. It'll serve you well on almost any platform. It converts really well in a tool like Pandoc. It's relatively straightforward, and I like telling people about Markdown, because it's a pretty accessible and easy to use, file type that, almost any machine or computer or whatnot can open up and use. And having this as a backbone or platform I think is a pretty solid choice. If text is more your speed, or LaTeX documents, I need to actually go for the next thing. Stanford has a license for Overleaf, and you can see that I clearly use my Overleaf account for updating my CV for all the places that I've applied to something at a program for the American Society of Engineering Education and program at SpaceX. And so I'm clearly using this really to update my CV, but there's other stuff in there, I promise. But one of the really great things that I like about Overleaf is that it takes a lot of the guesswork out of installing tech, and it makes it pretty accessible. And you can share these files. This was a file that we shared with a group from one of the Stanford summer research programs in biosciences. We did a coding week where we helped the students who were coming in learn some of the computational tools that we were using. And so we wrote up a cheat sheet partially in tech. And we did it in this way because one of the instructors was really big on it, and we had Overleaf, and we could collaborate on it and kind of introduce something else to students of, this will do your mathematical formulas really well, Microsoft Word won't. But if this is your speed of something to do, Overleaf, I think, is a pretty easy way to actually manage those tech files. And again, like you see clearly, I use it for one purpose, but it can be used for a lot more. And I think it's a lot easier than trying to install and maintain all the LaTeX software yourself. And so that's why we've got it there, and I like showing it to people. And also, it's a nice plug. The engineering library is the sort of institutional administrators for this, and so I guess technically it's a tool that I help administer here. So it's just, we're putting it out there again. I will be very remiss. I expect most people here have probably heard of Jupyter. But one thing that people might not know is that Julia and Python and R, aka Jupyter, are not the only three things that are supported by these notebooks. I've heard there's several people who don't use Jupyter notebooks. They use some other thing because it's not how their workflow operates, or they prefer to write up their Python script or whatever in a different, like Sublime or Atom or some IDE or something, and then just ping it away in Conda or something. That's totally fine. For sharing and sort of reproducible things and giving people sort of a binder or a lab notebook, Jupyter is a pretty good option. And I do think that Jupyter is a very accessible option for a lot of people that crosses a lot of languages and platforms. And I encourage people to use Jupyter if your workflow uses that and you think it would be a benefit for other people to have. I will also mention, in the sort of the same vein with Jupyter, there's a variety of electronic lab notebooks. There are bukus of them out there. You probably have some favorites. I won't go into terribly that much detail here about picking out one ELN or another, but just having a way to document that. I guess you could consider Jupyter kind of like in a similar vein to the lab notebooks, but there's probably a good chance that wherever you are, you may have an electronic version of a lab notebook, and having that is useful. Picking something that will go through those FAIR or REIF principles, if we want to invert it, that's more of my recommendation of trying to be more accessible that way. And so moving on a little bit from there are some platforms that you can share on. This is one of the biggest categories, and the odds are pretty low that you're going to use all these. In fact, some of these are probably competing products, and you won't use all of these. This is more kind of here's some possibilities to consider. Pick which one kind of works for you. And I'm going to start with Docker and Singularity. Probably most people have heard of containers, but you may not have. And containers are a way for you to package up all of the things that you have in computational research and share them out to somebody else in a platform that they can run. And it's a way to do that also for them not to have to worry about an operating system or whatever piece of hardware or software that you have. So there's plenty of instances of this lab has some computers that run some mass spec analysis, and of course the lab computers are all on Windows 95 because that's what the tool uses, and we don't want to update Windows 95 because we know this thing works and it doesn't break. The federal government loves to keep stuff on Fortran and COBOL because Fortran and COBOL and these machines work, and they would prefer not to mess with them. And if it works, why would we convert them? Even though not a lot of people know how to use this thing, and finding a computer that will work and do the same thing could be a little tricky. And so containers kind of allow you to ignore a lot of that. Just kind of focus on, hey, I'm going to package this up, and then I'm going to, allow other people to use it. The way that many of these will work is that, I've got actually on my machine, this computer that you see on the screen here with all the funny colored stickers. I have a couple of folders and virtual machines that will connect me to Singularity that I can use for, I've got this thing and I want to wrap it up in a container, and so then I can share it out with somebody and let it go. Docker and Singularity are probably the two biggest names in this space. There's probably a few others. I know that the popularity of these wax and wane. So I've heard that Docker is on the way out, and then it's back, and then it's on the way out, and then it's back. So there's a lot of different kind of versions of popularity, and frankly, I would kind of just tell you, pick which one you think you've got support for and can use, and go with that, and hopefully you don't have to change it too much. It's just what we're gonna, what you'll have. But Docker and Singularity are in many ways, they're standalone items, and maybe you want not just the container, but also the bigger platform to share stuff on. What can you do there? And there's a couple of platforms I'm going to bring up here. They all have their own specific use cases and interests. So this first one here is Protocols.io. We're members of this one. I actually had to, I remembered that I created one of these accounts, but I didn't actually go through the process of fully setting it up the last time that I was using it. And so unfortunately I had to go through it again. But Protocols.io, it's a platform for sharing research methods, research protocols. This is a service we subscribe to. I know a lot of people in the Dean of Research's office are really big on this. For those of you who use various protocols and testing methods in your work, looking probably mostly at you in medicine and life sciences and chemistry, pharmaceuticals, engineering, those kinds of things. It's probably more likely that you may use something like this. But if you need a way to share those protocols and methods that you've used, and you want to have a team gather around these things, this is a tool for you. Stanford subscribes to this, and I do want to give it a promotion and a shout out here, because I think it's, everybody that I've heard who uses this tool, they really like this tool. And so for those specific methods and protocols, this is a way for you to share those. Another tool that I'm going to bring up here is CodeOcean. So CodeOcean is a big shared computational platform. Many of those things that we talked about in this lecture, are going to talk about in this lecture, you can stick them here in one place. So like your Docker containers and your code books and all these other things, you can dump them in here. We also have a subscription to CodeOcean as well. It's another very popular tool. I know that there may be some raised eyebrows at the fact that this is a private company, and private companies like to, that are not named Alphabet or Meta or Amazon or Microsoft, like to get bought out by those companies. And so, or, whatever, and, spaces change. So, there may be some kind of questions about that, but the people who have used CodeOcean, who I've talked to about, they like it and they think it's a really robust tool. And I would actually recommend that, if you're looking at, a place to kind of do some of these things on, CodeOcean's a good choice. It's a pretty robust and complete platform. All the things that you want to share in sort of computational research setting, you can do that here on CodeOcean. And so I do want to, you've got little capsules, and this is kind of the standalone environment that contains all the code and data as well as all the settings and packages. So think of that like Docker Singularity container, but actually in a place that you can link people to instead of having to throw them a file all the time. So that's why I've got this here to kind of show. And a couple similar tools are, I have used OSF a lot. This is another big project management platform. Here, I'm actually digging into one of the sort of files I was going to share with people. This is a file that I worked on for the Scholarly Communication Committee of ASCE, the Engineering Libraries Division there. But basically, here's some best practices for increasing the visibility of your activities, and talking about get an Orchid. We're going to talk about that later. Use some principles of SEO, and negotiate with your publisher. Please negotiate with your publishers, people. And publish open access and things like that. But this is basically, you can see the project management kind of folder for my project here on ELD's SCC. And so we've got all the things that we want to do. We've got a little wiki here, and there's some various files we can put in. There's storage that OSF gives you. You can link out to your Google Drive storage for all the files that you want. There's ways that you can, everybody loves having the handy citations around to cite the things in here. And there's some really good examples of people. I saw an analysis of indexing of journals within various science abstract and indexing services, and sort of the overlap that those services have. And they put all their data into an OSF project, and that's a way to kind of share things out in that way. And OSF is another one of those platforms that I've used a lot in the past. I like mentioning it. There's another similar tool called Figshare. I have not used Figshare as much myself. Figshare does have some more like funder subscriber things to that effect. Figshare will work pretty similar to some of the other things that I've mentioned before. Some of you may use it, or you may like it more, but I know it's a very popular tool, and so I did want to mention is just here's this other alternative. Although I've used OSF a lot in the past, for example, and I like OSF. It's a really good tool. Figshare is as well. There's also your code, and there are a couple of places that people think about putting code, and the biggest ones in this field are probably GitHub, and there's other sites as well. I'm told that people still do use Subversion and Mercurial, but I think Git has a lot of champions and followers to spread its gospel around. And so a lot of people these days will use GitHub. I did need to mention that code.stanford.edu is on GitLab. And so I have to put in GitLab. GitLab is probably the biggest of the open source platforms for hosting a project online for Git. That used to be GitHub until Microsoft bought it. And the reviews about that, they've been mixed. I think that Microsoft has done quite a few nice things to GitHub, and so, there is that. But one of the things that you'll be able to do, I think in some ways, GitHub is turned on almost of a social network of a kind. It's almost like social media and social networking as much as it is a storing repository. And maybe that's kind of the point. They recognize, hey, it's okay if everybody puts their code in here and all, but does it really matter if anybody can find it? And so again, it's great. Make sure that your code is actually reusable and interoperable before you really worry about making it findable. But having it findable is a big deal. And so I do want to mention code.stanford.edu again is on GitLab, and there's other options. There's Bitbucket and the self-hosted version of Git. If you want, to run it yourself or, use another platform, that kind of thing. But GitHub and GitLab are probably the two biggest players in this space, mostly because, again, Git is probably the biggest player within version control. And having versioning is a good idea, and I encourage people to keep versions of their objects so that you can see over time how things have changed, even from sort of those final versions. It's at this point that I probably need to talk about repositories, other types of repositories, and you have a few choices. And so Amy Hodge and Hannah Frost are also CORES affiliates, and they were the product owner and product manager, respectively, of SDR over SDR's last development sprint. They would be really upset if I didn't mention SDR to you. And so I'm here to tell you about SDR, not just because it's a library project, but also because people may hunt me down if I don't tell you about it. But SDR will do a lot of things for you. It's got secure archival storage. They will mint you a DOI. They will index your items in SearchWorks, the library catalog. They'll provide version control for you. You get unlimited numbers of self-deposits. There's some fees for big stuff, but that's that. You have ways to have license controls and embargo options for handling requests. There's several questions that I help manage within SDR, and I also have deposited a few things in SDR myself, some book chapters and some FOIA requests and things that I've made. So I feel pretty famous that my name is in SearchWorks and in the Stanford category. It makes me feel good. And we also really love if you put a copy of your stuff in SDR, but also because SDR is the place where members of the academic council are required to deposit publications according to the new open access policy. So there's that too. Just putting that out there as well. But I do want to, I should actually visit SDR. I should visit SDR and kind of show you. Apparently, I have some approvals to make from a while ago. I think that one of my colleagues are probably going to make these approvals, but we've got some other student papers and the big ME 310 projects, which are pretty cool. But, and I've also deposited, things myself, which I guess it's, oh yeah, here's this. That's really great. See, look, I'm famous, and I did that just like a couple of days ago. SDR is out there. For some other more general repositories, things like that, there's a lot of preprint servers. Those are getting pretty big. For those of you who are in physics or math or other sorts of fields, I probably don't need to mention Archive, ARXIV. There's also EngineerChive. Lots of things like to use that Chive footage because Archive did it really well and they popularized it and made a big deal out of it. So for preprint servers, we'd love for you to put stuff in SDR, but there are also other disciplinary places for you as well. And many funders do have requirements for you too. So I know that NOAA, for example, requires you to put your work in a NOAA repository. The National Institutes of Mental Health has a repository that they require you to put your stuff in. And so if you have to put your stuff in that repository, please put your stuff in that repository. If your field has another convention, genomics has this, for example, use that convention. For everybody else, there's 2 recommendations that I like giving to people. We are members of Dryad, and I usually like to promote Dryad. Traditionally, I would do it for life, biological, medical sciences, those kinds of things. But Dryad will take anything, and Dryad is a service that I've used before quite a bit, and I really like Dryad as a repository to place your work. There's also Zotero as well, and Zotero was another big recommendation that I've had before and used before. And this is another sort of list to a sort of checklist for digital presence. Again, kind of the same thing that I talked about earlier with the ASCE one. This one is from the American Geophysical Union. And they're accelerating open and fair practices across the earth, space, and environmental sciences. So maybe we can get them to reverse the acronym or something. But anyway, that's I love this Parsec name. That's also pretty clever. But Zenodo is a repository that I've used in the past. I like to recommend to people as a big general thing. The people out of CERN run Zenodo, so I feel pretty good about Zenodo lasting for a very long time, and for the people at CERN to know what they're doing about supporting it, helping it, making sure that it will last. Make sure whatever repo you choose that they will have in writing language in their terms of service about how they're going to take care of you and your stuff. That advice applies to pretty much anything I'm recommending here, but I do want to mention it. And then finally, I got a couple of things in the potpourri at the end. So there is, let me find Zotero, another Z thing for you. So Zotero is a citation or bibliographic management tool. If you're not using a citation manager or a bid manager, I recommend that you pick one. Honestly, many of them have some pretty similar features and formats and things that they'll do. I personally like to recommend Zotero to people because it's open source, it's free. Storage is not necessarily free. If you go up to big stuff, you'll need to pay for storage, but it's relatively trivial to do that. And it has good integrations with Google Drive, with Microsoft Word, and it'll create bibliographies for you in a variety of different formats. Again, garbage in, garbage out. So if you have bad metadata, you're going to get bad results for your citation. So make sure that those are good. But you can also share folders. And so, there's some group libraries here where a power class that I help teach, or some stuff for the carpentries, or, a committee that I used to be on for, sort of open science initiatives. We've got libraries of shared content that, let's click on the power one and see what they're reading. So, they're reading all kinds of things about sort of numbers and data and rhetoric and sort of the information behind them. And these are things that students in the class have found and can be used as a launching off point for their work. And I think that's pretty interesting, but it's also useful to be able to track what you yourself are also writing as well. And so having one of these tools, you can also share it. It's a pretty good way to share your bibliographies. Those other sort of papers and things and patents or technical reports and things like that you found. And then last, there's Orchid. This was going to be the first thing that I was going to tell you about because this is the findable part. There are many research IDs out there. There's Google Scholar. They have their, the Google ID that you can use. Web of Science has an ID for researchers. Scopus has an ID for researchers. Dimensions has one. There's all kinds of these. The academic council here at Stanford has gotten behind Orchid and is hoping that all members of the academic council will have an Orchid. I've got my record here, and I link out to it quite a bit. But Orchid is a way for you to claim your research and make it identifiable, and to help people find you and the actual you. Stanford Libraries, we have a James R. Jacobs who does federal government documents. There's also a James R. Jacobs that works, I think, in either medicine or environmental health or something like that. And they just happen to have the same name, and they both, if they've got research, you need to find which one of them you're actually trying to cite. And so that's why we have Orchid. But ideally, people won't contact you unless you really need to. Hopefully your stuff is so good that they don't have to contact you. But just in case, having a clear way to do that, and not, oh, this postdoc left and they took the servers and they're in another country and we have no idea how to contact them. That would be less than ideal. So before I kind of go, I'm going to put this plug in. I'm sorry to all my colleagues if they get bombarded, especially Kim, because her name is first, and so she gets targeted the most probably. But here in the libraries, we've got several staff that do consulting appointments for many of the tools that I've kind of put out here and several others. And so I do want to put this out as you've seen something here and you think, hey, this is really cool, and I'd like to get some more information or talk to somebody who may have used it, or just some other thing that is on our list. We would be very happy to do that with you. And I think with that concludes what I've got to say. And we've got maybe a few minutes to do some questions. I'm also happy to stay a little bit beyond 4 too. And I need to get the inception window out now.
Hey, Zach, that was great. I do have a question for you. I was super excited to see the Overleaf cameo because that's my personal favorite. And I'm curious if you have a favorite kind of workflow for like reproducible manuscript writing in that platform where you're perhaps like pulling in results from, let's say, R or some program like that. Like that's something that, for myself, I've kind of cobbled something together, but, just curious if you have favorite ways to do that.
I think this is going to be different people are going to like their sauce stirred in a different way. For me, when I want to write stuff out, so if I'm actively using tech, I'll use Overleaf and kind of type it out there. A lot of people like book down and sort of taking scripts. If you're an R user, using that and Shiny and some other tools and sort of cobbling together all your scripts together. But I think that's going to vary a lot based on specifically. I don't have particular favorites or strong opinions on many of these things. And I think it's somewhat hard to make blanket recommendations, but that's there.
I'll go ahead and ask something. I'm wondering how, this question about, how we think about commercial versus open source projects is sort of an interesting one, right? Like I was actually really happy when GitHub was bought by Microsoft because it meant that GitHub is not going to go away anytime soon, right? And actually, I've come to be more and more concerned about like using, like having my workflows rely upon projects that are, relatively small open source projects. There's actually a risk that the thing either just, stops getting updated or, or just goes away. I'm wondering, how do you think about that tension?
So I know that like there are companies that, for example, may have their headquarters in Mountain View, California, right down the road, and have lots of different projects that they decide, oh, well, we don't like this one anymore, so we're going to shut it down. And they do that. And a lot of big companies will do that because that's just what they do. Like, for example, we had a lot of problems recently with Mendeley. So like Zotero and Mendeley are two of the research, citation management tools. And Mendeley got bought out by Elsevier, and we had a lot of problems with, the sort of institutional version flavor of Mendeley because Elsevier said, we're going to change the model around and we're going to stop supporting it in certain ways. And it was a big mess. So there is that. There is, it's an unfortunate reality that, people will shut down stuff when they shut down stuff, and that's a fact. And having open source projects is great until nobody starts working on them again. And, it does need to be noted that, Microsoft and Alphabet and several other big companies, they contribute to open source projects. I mean, like Android is literally, an open source thing that Google writes a ton of stuff for. And the Linux kernel, again, like, big companies contribute to the Linux kernel and they use it themselves. And I guess my general recommendation is, as best as you can, if you have files or platforms that are going to be interoperable across different software or different hardware or whatnot, if you can kind of adjust to that. Like a good example is people can agree on CSV as a file format. People like CSV, they agree on CSV.
Speak for yourself.
Okay, well, not everybody likes CSV then, but I know a lot of people who do. And so for a lot of people, it's a format that if you use that, you'll have a good chance of having your stuff work across any platform, no matter if somebody shuts something down or whatnot. And there's a rule that we have with backups where we talk about, there's a principle of having 3, 2, and 1, where you should have 3 copies of the stuff on 2 different media, and one of them should be far away, like the cloud or in Timbuktu or, just anywhere. And, I think that kind of principle is also true for, it's good to have a workflow and a set of ways that you do things, but I think it's also useful to consider alternate paths or what else you might use or want to transition to if something breaks or stops getting supported or gets bought out.
Yeah, totally agree with all of that. Maybe we need to have a separate talk session about like file format wars.
We could, although I think that would be very contentious.
I agree.
All right, everyone. Well, it sounds like no further questions. So thank you so much, Zac, for doing this for us. And this is the last of our fall lecture series, but we will be doing another round later next year. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks. Bye, all.
Bye.